Hi, everybody, and welcome to Quick Takes with Diverse Learners Cooperative. Today, we're talking about 3 quick tips for serving newcomer multilingual students. If you're unfamiliar with the DLC, we're an organization whose mission is to equip and empower teachers and leaders to serve all students. Today's mission is to understand more about students who are multilingual newcomers and to look at 3 ways that we can support these students. We'll talk about who our newcomers are and then look at 3 tips that help support them. So we're going to think about who are our newcomer students. These students are students who have a score on the WIDA access tests between 1.0 and 2.0, and they have more limited English skills. This student is at a minimum orally proficient in at least 1 other language. A newcomer student also may be reluctant to actively participate in the classroom at first, and they're going to have a varying degree of schooling experience. So they may have attended school previously in another country for a long period of time, a short period of time. It varies depending on which student you have in your class. So we're going to use an example student. His name is Eduardo, and he's going to be a newcomer in your school, and we're going to use his school experience to guide our thinking. We're thinking about services for our newcomer students. All EL students are required to get 60 minutes of EL service 5 days a week. This is going to take place in several different ways. It can be provided in the sheltered EL classroom, which means that all the students in the class are multilingual, or the services could be provided in a co-taught setting, a push-in setting, pull-out, or during the RTI block. For our friend Eduardo, he is in 6th grade, and he receives his required daily services through a co-taught setting in ELA, and also gets a language-focused RTI block a couple of different times a week. So our first tip, number 1, is know your students. Teacher knowledge of students is imperative to student success, and even more so for students who may be unfamiliar with a school setting that is like yours. So we have to get to know who our students are in our class, and I'm going to give you a few ideas of how you can do that. The first question we want to think about is what's important to know. When a student comes into your class, they're going to have a ton of information that's data related that comes to you, hopefully. You'll get a cumulative file on them, and it's going to give you a lot of different information. So how do we dig through that and figure out what's important? The first thing we want to think about are their different domain levels for access. So a lot of times we'll think about students' overall score, and for Eduardo, his overall score is a 1.6. But what's really important is thinking about where he is at each of the 4 domains. So for reading, he's 1.7, writing, he's a 1.5, speaking 1.2, and listening 1.9. That information gives us a lot to go off of when we're thinking about how to support and how to plan for what he needs in the classroom. Another important piece of information to pull from the data is the country and language of origin. So Eduardo arrived from his home country of Mexico and registered for school on March 14th, 2021. That date of entry for US schools is also really important because a lot of times students may be coming to our school for the first time, but they may not be at US schools for the very first time. We want to know how many years this child has been in school. So according to Eduardo's records, he attended school through the 6th grade in Mexico. And so he's in the appropriate grade when he attended here. We also want to know what kind of communication point person we might have with Eduardo. It could be a relative that's not mom or dad, or it could be their mom, their dad, it could be both. So that data is going to tell us who we should communicate with and if the translations are required for that person and what those translations might be. So for Eduardo, he moved with his mom and younger brother, and they're currently living with the aunt, uncle, and cousins who are also attending our same school. So that's going to be really, really helpful for us to know because we hopefully already have a relationship with the family that Eduardo is living with. That's going to help streamline some of the communications as we go forward. It's going to help us onboard them, his family, to the school. It's going to help us connect with the younger brother as well and know how to support them best. We also want to go beyond the basics of just that data that's in front of us. So we want to build a relationship with this student. That's going to be where we're going to make so much of the difference in our education with them. So 2 ways that we can do this. One is student interest surveys, and I've linked 2 here on the slides. So after you watch this video, you can download the slides and click through, and all of these are linked. So there's a few that you can see here that are in English, and I would encourage you to get these translated into our students' native language, or have a student work with them, or a peer. You could do it side by side with this student and walk through it with them if you didn't have ability to translate immediately. But these student interest surveys are going to give us a lot of good information about our students' experience at school, what they like about school, what their living situation is like, things that they're interested in, which is going to help us when we're pulling in content for our classroom. The other piece that is super valuable is home visits. And this is something that can be really intimidating, but it can be really, really powerful. And it sends such a good message to the family that we are partnering with them and coming alongside them to work. So a couple of tips. And if you click on the words home visit on these slides and the little icon, there's 2 different articles linked that have some other really good resources and tips. But for home visits, we want to make sure that we take a translator with us who speaks the appropriate dialect. So a lot of times our students and families will say that they speak a language such as Spanish, but there's also often a language that they're more comfortable with that is a different dialect. So several of our students here in Nashville speak Quechua, and so we could take a translator that speaks that language with us to make the family feel more comfortable. We know that family members' names are super important, so we want to make sure that we know what their names are before we go. It's also valuable and helpful to bring student work and a small gift if that's appropriate, just something to show that you're on their side, something really positive. And this visit is meant to be positive, respectful, and empathetic. You are not there to oversee their home, to check in on what the situation is like. You're there to build a bridge between the school and the student's home life. All right, tip number 2, we want to think about translations in an appropriate way. So translations are often a go-to resource that we use when we have newcomer students, and they can be an effective way to communicate with our students. But we want to be appropriate and supportive in the way in which we use these. So a couple of translation do and don'ts. So on our do list, we want to use accessible work first. So translations are not the solution, they're a tool. We want to first think about other tools that we can use. We want to explicitly teach vocabulary, pre-teach concepts during RTI, and include lots of graphics, images, realia, that vocabulary. These students are coming in if they are rapidly acquiring vocabulary. We also want to teach students how to use 2 language dictionaries. So if I have a student that speaks German, then I'm going to give them an English-German dictionary that has both sides of German English as well, so that they can, and then teach them how to use that in the classroom. I'm going to allow my students to use supports during lessons and assignments. This is a basic thing, but I'm going to remind all of us that our goal is for students to get the learning target, and using these supports such as translations, once I've taught students how to use them, it's going to help them access that material. We want to have a plan for reducing the usage over time for translations and translation materials, especially technological supports. So we want to think about how long is appropriate for this student, and that's going to really vary student by student and classroom by classroom. A lot of it's going to depend on what background knowledge a student has in the language and in the content area. So if they have a ton of chemistry knowledge and we're in chemistry, we're going to start pulling back on some of those language supports because they might be able to use other ways to find access to the material. We also want to check for understanding after we've used translations. So we can do that using a translator. We could use a language partner, and we can use accessible work to make sure that students are not just copying over the translation or, they're processing actually what we're doing. We also want to remember that their home language is an asset to their learning. So we don't have to put everything in English. It's okay for things to be in their native language. That's an asset, and we want to build students' literacy in both of their languages. Our goal is for students to truly be multilingual at the end of their school experience. Some don'ts for translations is we don't want to start with translated materials always. We're not going to just start giving them things that are translated at the very beginning, because that can, we want to encourage them instead to use all of their tools for language acquisition. We don't want to be afraid of good struggle. So we want to allow students to make meaning first, to really get into the English and to look at the content in a different way. So don't be afraid of a little bit of good struggle. We also don't want to use translation devices when having conversations to build student relationships. So I want to communicate with my student, and going back to our first tip, we want to get to know our students, but we need to do that in a human connection way. We can't just always use Google Translate. So in this case, human connection wins. Students really, really appreciate when we take the effort to communicate with them face to face, especially students who are newcomers. These students often feel isolated and alone. And so a face-to-face conversation, even if there's a little bit of good struggle there, is going to go a long way for them. We also don't want to forget to help peers develop tools for communication with their new students and these new students in our class. And so we want our other students to be able to build their communication tools so that they're not relying on translations either. We can give them sentence stems, we can have practice conversations, we can do all kinds of things to build bridges between students that don't always involve translations. So if we're thinking about our friend Eduardo, we want to look at all of his different access levels and access scores. And we know that he's going to benefit from a gradual release of material translation. So we might do a little bit more at the beginning. He's got some lower level proficiencies here in English. And so giving him some translated materials is going to help him at different times. Since his lowest proficiency level is in speaking, I would use translation as a way to help him boost his speaking confidence. So allow him to translate his thoughts before asking him to speak them out loud with a trusted peer or another safe discussion partner. I've linked a few different translation tools that you can use. Yandex, Talking Points is a parent communication app that's available in lots of different languages. Google Translate is one that we're all familiar with probably. And then I also linked a really cool resource about using translations during instruction. So be sure to click on that when you go to the document. All right, and our last tip is to think about how we can provide our students with really clear expectations. So more than almost anything else, students learning English and navigating new settings need clear expectations to be laid out for them. And we want to think about all the expectations that students have during the day. So we're not just talking about classroom expectations in terms of work, but also expectations about how to behave and communicate in different situations. How do you go through the lunch line? How do you ask for what you need when you need to use the restroom? How do you turn in your papers? All of those things really need to be communicated clearly to our students so they feel comfortable in our new environment. We want them to know what work is for practice and why it's for practice. So that helps students understand that the work is important for them. We want to know what's going to be graded and why. We want to know what the teacher's looking for, and that we can do that using exemplar assignments for students. It's going to be helpful to communicate the daily routine and the schedule just so students know what's coming next. A lot of schools have a different schedule based on the day of the week. And so providing students with that overview, they've probably missed a lot of that stuff at the beginning of the year. So really thinking through what they need from that part of the year when they come in later is going to be really valuable for them. We want students to know how they can participate in classroom activities. Are we going to call on them? Are they going to have a chance to speak in front of the group? If so, are they going to have a chance to practice that with somebody before we speak with them? We also want to know how they communicate about different types of issues and where to go about certain issues. So if they're having, a particularly hard day, if they're feeling emotional, if they need to talk to a counselor, how can we do that for them? How can we provide that for them in a safe way in their native language? All of those things communicated up front are going to save us time when it comes down the line for our students, and also provide them with a safer classroom experience. Another way that we want to communicate our expectations for students is to think about language objectives. So the thing that I tell teachers when they're asking, especially general education teachers who have not as much experience working with multilingual students, and they say, what's one thing I can do to help serve these students? The first thing I say is think about planning language objectives, putting those in your lesson. These, if you're teaching virtually, then you can put them virtually, in person. These are applicable to everybody, they're accessible to everybody, and they ensure that we're going to be intentional about how students are using language in the classroom. So a content objective tells what a student's going to learn. We use those all the time. That's the student will be able to, and it tells what's our target for the lesson. A language objective talks about how a student is going to use language to demonstrate their learning. And the reason that we do that is because it sets the stage for learning for both the student and for the teacher. So if we're thinking about our friend Eduardo here, who's a 1.6, and I'm planning in my classroom for him, my content objective is going to be that students can identify and explain the main idea of the story that we're reading. For Eduardo and my other multilingual students, I need to think about how am I expecting them to use language to get to this content objective. So some of the language objectives that I might have in place are that the student will read the annotated text with the same language partner. Students are going to write the main idea of the story using sentence frames and illustrations. Also, students are going to speak with a partner about their ideas before writing. So those are 3 different domains of language that are all going to be used in that singular lesson. And this is going to help Eduardo as he goes forward knowing this. I might translate these for him at the very beginning of my lesson and gradually move away, or I might translate individual words for him. I might do this in a visual way to show reading, to show writing, to show speaking in different icons. All of those things are going to help him know the expectations for what's going to be coming ahead in class. It's going to help him participate because he knows that this language and this material is going to be accessible for him. All right, so to recap, 3 quick tips, and these are by no means comprehensive or exhaustive, but 3 ways to get started serving your multilingual newcomer students. Number 1 is to get to know your student, using that data that's available to you and putting time in that you can invest into the relationship. Our second tip is to use tools for translation as effectively and thoughtfully as possible. And our last tip is to provide students with clear and appropriate expectations. Here's some additional resources that you might find helpful. Click on them when you go through the slides and dig into some ways that you can better support your newcomer students and be prepared for any student that walks into your classroom tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you ever have questions, you can always reach out to me. My email is mary@diverselearnerscoop.com. You can also check out our website, which is diverselearnerscoop.com. We've got a ton of different resources on there, lots of videos from previous quick takes and coffee chats that we did. And we would love to work with you at any time and answer any of your questions. Thank you so much for being here.